Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Trump's top envoy Steve Witkoff meets Putin in Moscow just days before the ceasefire deadline. And Netanyahu clashes with his army chief as reports of a full Gaza occupation spark alarm at the UN, while Trump says it's up to Israel to decide. Plus, Trump lifts Syria sanctions, then slaps the country with record high tariffs. Experts warn of fallout. Donald Trump is now calling Russia an extraordinary threat to the U.S. national security as he unveils his first major round of sanctions against Moscow. The move follows a high-stakes 3-hour meeting in Moscow between Vladimir Putin and Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff. The visit comes ahead of the president's Friday deadline for Russia to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine or face broad economic penalties. For more on this, I'm joined by Norman Roule, former senior intelligence official. Norman, a pleasure to have you on the show. First of all, we've just been hearing from Donald Trump in the last half an hour, and he's saying Russia is an extraordinary threat to the US. We did see a smiling President Putin meeting US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Witkoff has been criticized for the tone of his previous visits to Russia. After Trump's comments, how constructive and useful were these talks?
Good evening to you and to your viewers. There is no evidence yet that the current round of talks have been constructive. That will only be measured in coming days as we see whether the pace of Russian air attacks on Kyiv, on Ukrainian civilian centers declines, and there's no indication that has happened. We can expect Russian statements on these talks to remain upbeat because that's part of their general propaganda. But I think we can also expect to see in coming days American statements to be increasingly strong and severe. The president is clearly out of patience, and he's putting the pressure on Moscow to make concessions before Friday.
And that's interesting because given Trump's history of unpredictable positions on Ukraine, he is holding a phone call right now with Volodymyr Zelensky. What should we be expecting from this? Because now, as you said, we see the frustration clearly with Moscow.
Correct. And I think the president's position, based upon his statements, is that he has been extraordinarily patient and generous with Moscow. But there have been hundreds of civilian strikes on civilian targets by Russia. The Russians have not demonstrated sincerity in any of the talks. They have not provided the president with any indication that his patience would lead to any sort of truce in any shape or form. And at this point, the president needs to provide a package of pressures, and that pressure will be sanctions, support for Ukraine, public statements that shows that America is united in this position, and a constant pressure as he moves towards Friday's plan for secondary sanctions on Russia's trade partners.
Norman, let's talk a little bit about military action against Ukraine from Russia. Today's meeting comes as Russian forces hit a recreational center in southern Ukraine, killing at least 2 people and injuring many more. Does this strike make military sense?
Well, it doesn't, but let's begin by saying that Russia conducted these strikes knowing that Steve Witkoff was coming to Moscow, knowing that the president's deadline was approaching. This was an opportunity for Moscow to show flexibility and an interest in peace. And instead, Moscow launched 45 drones against civilian targets in several cities, killing children. Now, we have seen hundreds of Russian missile and drone attacks on civilian targets throughout Ukraine. There is a raft of evidence. So why does Russia do this? And there are good reasons for Russia to do this based on its military doctrine. It disrupts and destroys critical infrastructure. This would work against Ukraine's morale. This disrupts its energy. It weakens civilian infrastructure, even moves populations within Ukraine to weaken Ukraine's ability to respond. And it also promotes the possibility that Ukraine is willing to make concessions just to reduce the pace of Russian attacks. But it shows that Russia is not following laws of war. Russia is not interested in reducing these sorts of attacks. And again, it puts the president in a difficult position because this cannot be defended. And Russia, again, shows it's not interested in halting these sorts of attacks. These attacks last night were a very important signal. Russia had an opportunity to change its ways, and it did not do so.
And Norman, President Trump has imposed an additional 25% tariff on India over these oil imports, the Russian oil imports. Trump is really starting to play his sanctions card, and we've seen that when it comes to Russia. But does Putin believe he still has the upper hand? Because as we said, he's intensifying attacks on Ukraine. He doesn't seem to be listening, and the package of sanctions that could be coming on Friday haven't deterred Russia at all.
Well, a couple of things are happening. The Russians are leaking the story that they may be interested in a possible cessation of air attacks by Friday. That's probably to delay sanctions. Russia is also leaking that perhaps their territorial interests are more modest, only several oblasts or portions of eastern Ukraine. But all indications are that Vladimir Putin has never veered from his original objectives, which is the ultimate destruction of Ukraine as an independent, sovereign country. This said, the president's approach over recent days and weeks has been a package approach. And the sanctions that the president has placed upon India are consistent with what we've seen in the last week and a half. The president has messaged senators that he would be doing this, and placing such significant sanctions on India will also message Turkey, China, and other countries that the president is serious. And therefore, this will also produce diplomatic pressure, hopefully, by these countries on Russia to make concessions and come to a peaceful approach for this conflict.
So a lot of people are wondering if Donald Trump is going to impose, we have seen this new 25% tariff on India over Russian oil today, but many people are saying, is Donald Trump going to chicken out on Friday and he's not going to go full steam ahead with this package against Russia? What's your feeling on that?
I think it's less important to focus on timing and more important to focus on the ultimate purpose of all of these actions. President Trump has shown flexibility on timing. He's willing to make extensions to tariff deadlines routinely, but ultimately he doesn't veer from his objective as to what he's looking for from his interlocutors. And in this case, he's looking for serious peace negotiations from Russia, and his willingness to target Delhi, which has gone from 0.2 of 1% of its oil sales from Russia prior to this conflict to now almost a third of its oil sales from Russia with profound sanctions is a powerful message that he is willing to be committed to this approach by Friday. I would not think that he is going to change his ultimate objective, but it is possible he may change the deadline by a few days, but I would not read too much into that.
And just a response from India, they say the US tariffs unfair, unjustified and unreasonable after Donald Trump did announce an additional 25% tariff on India over Russian oil imports today. Norman Roule, thank you so much for your analysis and insights. Tensions are rising within Israel's leadership, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly clashing with Army Chief Eyal Zamir over plans to fully occupy Gaza. Defense Minister Israel Katz has publicly backed Zamir amid talks he could resign. At the UN, diplomats called the reports of expanded military action deeply alarming, and when asked where he stands, Donald Trump said it's up to Israel to decide. For more on this, I'm joined from Herzliya by Middle East correspondent and author Jotam Confino. Jotam, great to have you on the show. So Netanyahu has clashed with army chief over this Gaza plan. What dangers does this reported rift between the Israeli army and Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government pose?
Well, I would say in a worst case scenario, the IDF chief would resign. That would be a huge scandal, really, because he is the leader of the military. It would also have a trickle-down effect on other senior members, probably in the military, who could likely follow suit. It could also inspire soldiers not to participate in this occupation of Gaza. So really, if it really comes to a worst-case scenario where the IDF chief resigns because he believes that what Netanyahu and the government are doing is in violation of international law, that could have a huge repercussions for the military. But also, I would say this rift between Netanyahu and some of the far-right ministers, and then, of course, the senior military leadership, it also reflects the rift inside the Israeli public, because there are many, many people who oppose the annexation and the occupation of Gaza. Roughly half of Israelis, at least half of Israelis, oppose this, while the other half are, some of them, supportive of this, and others maybe don't really know where they stand. But this is definitely a really serious problem to have inside the leadership, having the IDF chief and the prime minister going head-to-head on such a crucial issue.
And Jotam, what are the practical implications of the Israeli army fully occupying Gaza? And what consequences could this military operation have, especially as the UN warns the plan is deeply alarming ahead of tomorrow's government vote?
Well, let's start with the implications for the hostages. That is one of the reasons why the IDF chief does not want to go ahead with this, because he believes that it's going to pose a danger for the hostages. First of all, because Hamas and other terror groups could start killing the hostages, as they did last year when they see that the Israeli military are coming close to where they are, but they could also be killed by IDF in mistakes. So that is a huge implication of starting to occupy Gaza. But then you have, of course, all the other repercussions. This means that Israel will going to have to probably have tens of thousands of soldiers stationed permanently inside Gaza, which will mean that a lot of them will be killed. That's something that the IDF chief reported. He also told Netanyahu that several soldiers could be killed in the beginning of this land grab. And of course, it also means that Israel is going to de facto have responsibility for more than 2 million Palestinian civilians. They will have to make sure that they have food, water, electricity, everything that has to do with infrastructure, essentially running their lives. That would be up to Israel. So it's a huge undertaking, and something that, of course, could last years depending on the next government and if they want to continue following the suit of this government.
And the UN has reported that nearly 90% of aid trucks entering Gaza since mid-May have been looted. What does this mean for the humanitarian crisis on the ground, Jotam? And how are these aid agencies now planning to respond to something like this?
It's a disaster, but we've seen this from day one. We've seen trucks with aid being looted by gangs, definitely also by terror groups. And this is really, it has huge repercussions for the civilians in Gaza, because a lot of aid is actually entering Gaza. Nearly 2 million tons of aid entered Gaza since October the 7th. But as you just mentioned here, from May 19th until now, that's the most recent data on this looting of aid, 90% of aid was looted. That means that hungry kids and civilians in general are not getting the aid that they need. And as for the UN, what they plan to do with this, look, they don't have an answer. They refuse to have IDF or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation escorting the trucks, making sure that they're not looted. They refuse to have that. So what is the option, really? It is a disaster, because at the end of the day, it means that the civilians in Gaza are not getting the aid that's entering Gaza every single day.
And we have heard today, Jotam, more than 20 Palestinians have been killed after an aid truck overturns. And that's according to health authorities in Gaza. And as we know, we've seen those pictures of malnutrition in children in Gaza and adults. But I just want to move on to another part of the story. The US Senator Bernie Sanders said billions of taxpayer dollars are being spent on a policy which is starving little kids. His comments came after Trump was questioned on Israel's campaign in Gaza. Right now, where does the US stand?
First of all, I think it's important to mention that Bernie Sanders' accusation is, I would say, far-fetched, because quite literally, millions of dollars of American taxpayers' money is going to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which feeds civilians in Gaza. So quite the opposite. But another thing, obviously, where does the United States stand? Because Bernie Sanders represents the Democrats and the left wing. But of course, Donald Trump is in power now. He looks at this very differently. I would say essentially Donald Trump has given Israel carte blanche to do pretty much whatever they want. The only thing he needs to make sure of is that civilians in Gaza don't continue to starve, or at least those who starve won't continue to starve. So he is continuing to pressure Israel into making sure that more aid enters, and also that the US will play a larger role in distributing aid going forward. This is pretty much the only issue where Donald Trump is holding Israel accountable, but anything else, ranging from occupation to military operations to ceasefire negotiations, he's kind of letting Netanyahu pretty much do whatever he wants.
Jotam Confino, thank you for joining us and for your insights and analysis as always. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. At least 4 people have been killed and buildings swept away after intense rains rushed down narrow mountains in a Himalayan village in India. Authorities say around 130 people have been rescued as army helicopters are on standby to provide supplies to those stranded. Meanwhile, at least 11 Indian army soldiers were reported missing from a camp in nearby Halsal after the floods. The prime suspect in the murder of 4 people and the kidnapping of a baby in Tennessee has been arrested. Authorities say Austin Robert Drummond knew the victims through his girlfriend. Drummond is facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated kidnapping, 4 counts of felon in possession of a firearm, and 1 count of possession of a firearm. Actress Keely Mack, known for her appearance in zombie drama The Walking Dead, has died at the age of 33 after battling glioma for the central nervous system. Mack held 35 actress and 5 producer credits during her career. Now, Iran has ruled out direct talks with the US, saying it will hold Washington accountable for attacks on its nuclear sites. The strikes in June, part of Israel's broader assault, derailed high-level negotiations on Tehran's atomic program. Iran's vice president has said Washington destroyed the negotiating table, deepening global distrust in US commitments. For more on this, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Mark Fitzpatrick, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. So, Iran has ruled out direct talks with Washington. What does that mean for the future of nuclear negotiations between both of the countries?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Leigh-Ann. I don't think that Iran's refusal to talk directly to the United States impedes negotiations unless the United States team decides to take offense. But, for the last couple of years, Iran wouldn't speak directly with the United States. They did so indirectly via Oman, and talks proceeded. And they actually look like they might be getting somewhere, but they just broke apart over one key issue. So if the United States is willing to swallow its pride and say, okay, we can do the indirect talks, then they can go ahead and talk.
So you don't think that this is a major concern at all in the negotiations? Because as you said, indirect talks have been happening. But how economically damaged is Iran at the moment, if we have a look at it? Because they have heavy sanctions on them. And we saw those big attacks in June on Iran's nuclear facilities. So where does Iran stand right now? What cards does Iran hold?
Yeah, you would think that Iran might not hold too many cards because, as you indicated, it's under economic pressure from sanctions. It's been under that pressure for several years. And one thing about sanctions is that over time, the impact erodes because the country against whom they are directed, Iran, finds workarounds. And Iran has been able to sell its oil to China via so-called teapot, smaller entrepreneurs and so forth. So they're getting by. They're not on the verge of collapse or anything. And then the second point you mentioned is very important, that Iran had its military capabilities severely degraded by Israel, both last year and then again this June, and the United States piled on. So Iran has to always realize that both Israel and the United States could attack again, and Iran is pretty much defenseless against that.
Tehran is demanding guarantees against military action. Do you see any realistic path for such assurances in the future?
Well, it's possible the United States could give such guarantees. The issue is whether they would be legally binding. Iran is always asking for legally binding guarantees, and no guarantees are going to be legally binding and lasting, because even if, say, President Trump were to give legally binding guarantees and the Congress backed that up, neither of which is likely, the next president, the next Congress could change that. So what Iran is demanding here is not really possible. And so to get back to your original question, are talks feasible? I think more important than Iran's refusal to meet directly is this demand for something, legal guarantees, that's just not feasible.
Iran's vice president says the US destroyed the negotiating table. How much damage has that done to global trust in American diplomacy when we look at Iran and the Middle East, Mark?
Yeah, as a former diplomat, it really bothers me that pledges that were made were broken. And I'm talking about, first of all, here in 2018, when President Trump in his first term broke the deal that his predecessor had reached with Iran and 6 other countries. It broke that even though Iran was honoring it. And then in June, when the United States was negotiating with Iran, and they had set up a 6th round of talks, and then 2 days before that, the United States attacked. That certainly undermines trust. And so when Iran says that the United States blew up the negotiating table, they're certainly right. Does that make it impossible for the United States to conduct diplomacy and strike deals? No, because the United States has so many cards, economic might and threat of tariffs and threat of military attacks, that other countries have to swallow their anger and make deals and get as much upfront as they can in case those deals are broken later.
And Mark, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what happens next. So obviously we do see the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, and the possibility of moving to some sort of negotiations when it comes to the nuclear program. But right now, we don't know what enrichment is looking like in Iran. What does the future hold? Could this be destabilized again? Could the uranium program in Iran still be thriving? Does anyone have the answers to this?
I'm not at all optimistic about the future of this, because the basic issue remains that Iran insists on the right to uranium enrichment, whether it's happening or it's not happening right now because their facilities were bombed, but it might be happening in secret somewhere. And the United States insists on no enrichment, and those positions seem to be unalterable. There could be a path forward if there was a will on both sides. For example, the United States possibly could acknowledge that, in theory, Iran could enrich at some future point, and Iran could say, well, we're not enriching now anyway because our facilities have been destroyed, and so we won't do it for the time being. Some kind of if there was a will, they could reach something like that. Or there could be a way to enrich on, outside Iran. This idea has been floated, and Iran has rejected that. But as I say, if they really wanted to make a deal, diplomats can come up with solutions.
Yes, indeed. Mark Fitzpatrick, a pleasure to have you on and have your thoughts. Thank you for joining us. Japan has been commemorating 80 years since the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It killed some 80,000 people in an instant, but many more died from their injuries and radiation sickness. The country's prime minister vowed to continue the country's work against the proliferation of nuclear arms, so it never happens again. And he says means it never happens again. Chris Gilbert is in Tokyo with this very story.
A bell to mark the moment that killed thousands. Officials, school children, and people from around the world held a minute's silence as they took part in the 80th anniversary commemorations of the US bombing of Hiroshima. It was the first time the atomic bomb was used. Some 140,000 people died. Most were civilians.
As Prime Minister, I would like to offer my sincerest condolences to the souls of those who fell victim to the atomic bomb. I would also like to offer my heartfelt sympathy for the survivors who are still suffering from the after effects of the atomic bombing.
Over 50,000 people from around the world took part in the memorial ceremony. They laid wreaths and flowers. Nearby, the flame of peace continued to burn. For as long as nuclear weapons exist, Japan has said it will keep the flame alive. Japan is the only country in the world to have been subjected to a nuclear bomb. That means that there is a painful, detailed knowledge here of what that looks like on the ground. So successive leaders have pledged to try to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but many people here are afraid that that won't be enough. Peace activists gathered at the riverside for their own moment of remembrance with a view of Hiroshima's atomic bomb dome. It's one of the few things that was still standing at Hiroshima's ground zero. The Peace Park and its dome serve as a powerful reminder of what's at stake.
I truly want the world to be peaceful, but there's just far too much mass killing going on of ordinary civilians. What's happening in Palestine is really the worst, isn't it?
Flower petals for a river that became poison. In the wake of the bombing, badly burnt people rushed to Hiroshima's multiple rivers for relief, but the water was radioactive. Once a place of carnage, now a place of culture.
After people see this, I want them to notice a painting they've never seen before, and to make them think. Thinking about things like this can become a starting point for thinking about peace, and that's something I truly hope for.
Though the number of nuclear weapons in the world have fallen well below their Cold War peak, there are still some 13,000, and each one is far more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. As Japan mourns, it also warns. This could still happen again. Chris Gilbert, Arabiya English.
In May, President Trump surprised audiences by announcing a full lifting of US sanctions on Syria. Yet, less than 3 months later, his administration imposed a 41% tariff on the country, the highest for any nation. Analysts warn the move could undermine Syria's fragile post-war recovery, limiting much-needed trade and also investment. For more on this, I'm joined from London by Abdul Aziz Almashi, board member of the Syrian British Consortium. A pleasure to have you on our show, Abdul Aziz. OK, a 41% trade tariff on Syria seems extremely steep as the country emerges from years of civil war. Why has President Trump imposed such a high levy on the country as trade between the two countries is just so small?
To be honest, we are all surprised by the impose of such a high tariff on Syria. But I think the tariff is more political than economic. As you mentioned, the trade between Syria and between the US has been minimal for decades. And we all heard President Trump saying many times that he wants to give Syria a second chance. He wants to see, peace and prosperity and stability in Syria. And that's why he left the sanctions from Syria, which is the right step in the right direction. But imposing a 41% tariff isn't really going to help. So the US should be encouraging the recovery and the reforms in Syria, and the new Syrian government trying to rebuild the country from the ruin. And that's why we are really surprised by the move. But hopefully the impact isn't going to slow the recovery for the long term. Obviously, lifting the sanction is the most important thing, and we don't think imposing a tariff is as serious as imposing sanctions. So the biggest obstacle was the sanction, and now it is our work as Syrians to try to lobby President Trump to reconsider his decision on this, because as you have seen, he has been changing his mind on the tariffs very frequently recently.
And will the new tariffs imposed on Syria stop the country developing beneficial trade ties with the US? And if so, what countries will step in to help Syria with aid and rebuilding?
Yes, absolutely. The tariff makes meaningful US-Syria trade very unlikely, at least in the short term. But in the meantime, already there have been countries in the region like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia who already stepped in with the major investment and aid pledges. Even in some European countries, they are re-engaging. So while the US maintain economic pressure, other really they are involved in the reconstruction of Syria and have gaining influence in the ground.
Security analysts are warning that instability in parts of Syria could tip it back into war and a greater humanitarian crisis. How concerning is the violence in Syria right now under the new leadership?
The violence is very concerning, to be honest, but I think it is important for us to understand what is driving it. Some of the instability isn't internal. It's been fueled by criminal armed groups who are backed up by external powers and who are trying to derail Syria from the path of recovery. We know, Israel has been playing a really dirty role in this. Also, Iran and the Russians had a massive hit by the fall of the Assad regime. So their influence in Syria have been reduced sharply. So a lot of regional power, they are trying to destabilize Syria. And that's why, the leadership, the new leadership should offer more hope. And in order for the new leadership to give a chance for Syria, we need to make sure that there are no armed groups out there, and that the Syrian government will obviously control the whole country, because you can't have a country which is fragmented and unstable. This is the biggest challenge when it comes to rebuild the country and also rebuild the trust between our communities.
Abdul Aziz, some analysts speculate that the US tariffs could be a way to pressure Damascus into normalizing relations with Israel. You touched on Israel there for me. What do you make of this analysis?
I think this is a credible theory. The US has been pushing for a broader normalization in the region with Israel. And, Syria has always been a sticking point. So using tariff, as a leverage may be part of that strategy. However, in Syria, I think the priority and the main focus for the current government isn't to normalize the relationship with Israel, but to bring stability and peace to the country and rebuild the country. And to be honest, the new Syrian government, they don't even have the mandate to go and normalize the relation with Israel. They are just an interim government, and they don't have mandate from the Syrian people to go and strike deals with Israel that is going to impact, the future relation, the regional relations between us and between our neighbors.
Abdul Aziz Almashi, thank you so much for your insights and for speaking to us this evening. Let's take a look at the top business news now. Over 6.8 million WhatsApp accounts have been removed after being linked to scams. That's according to the parent company Meta, who say many of the accounts were tied to scam centers in Southeast Asia using forced labor. And 2 advertisements by Zara featuring unhealthily thin models have been banned by the British Advertising Standards Authority, the watchdog ruling that the supposedly irresponsible ads must not appear again. Zara said that both models in the now deleted ads had medical certification proving they were in good health when these pictures were taken. Turning to all the sports news now, and football player Son Heung-min has agreed to a contract with the Los Angeles FC after a decade at Tottenham Hotspur. The club reportedly paid a transfer fee of more than $20 million for the 33-year-old South Korean superstar. And 3 brothers are on the final stretch of a 9,000-mile journey across the Pacific Ocean. The trio of Ewan, Jamie and Lachlan McLean are rowing in an attempt to complete the fastest ever unsupported 3-man row across the Pacific Ocean. The brothers hope to raise over $1 million to fund clean water projects in Madagascar. A reminder of our top stories. Trump's top envoy Steve Witkoff meets Putin in Moscow just days before the ceasefire deadline. Netanyahu clashes with his army chief as reports of a full Gaza occupation spark alarm at the UN, while Trump says it's up to Israel to decide. Plus, Trump lifts Syria sanctions and then slaps the country with record-high tariffs. Experts warn of fallout. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, follow us on X. Counterpoints with Melinda News Sephora is coming up next. Plus, we'll be back in a couple of hours' time with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you for joining us.